The disposable respirator is a simple enough device, a cheap, easy-to-use mask designed to keep dust out of the lungs. But over the years, critics of that simple respirator have raised serious questions. They said some masks didn't go far enough to protect workers against deadly dust like asbestos. Now, some nurses who are worried they'll come into contact with Ebola are also asking the government tough questions and wondering if the mask they'll wear will protect them. Jill Kropp has the story.
It was a time when North America was the factory for the world. A generation before Made in China. A time when jobs were plentiful for people who made things. In the 60s and 70s, it seemed like the economy would grow forever. But an invisible threat was growing as well. People learned poisons in the workplace could kill if they didn't have a way to protect themselves.
Increasingly, in recent years, we're discovering that the seeds of some cancers are being sown in the workplace.
So, many employers and workers put part of their trust in a revolutionary piece of equipment, the face mask.
Today, thanks to the cooperation of safety men in many industries and government departments who supported and helped guide the development of respiratory protection, the menace in the air is removed for those who wear respirators.
Back in the 1970s, Michael Leslie worked in a factory that made molded fiberglass, a place where, he says, the air was often thick with asbestos dust.
We bought it in like 40, 50-pound bags, heavy-duty bags, and it was just a real soft, billowy, wasn't real heavy, but it was, you know, if you go like that, dust would just fly off of it.
Michael didn't know much about asbestos or its dangers, but he says he dealt with dusty air at a previous job and didn't want to breathe it in at this one.
I got kind of kicked in the pants when I saw that stuff coming through the window. It was like a realization that I don't care what anybody says, I don't want to breathe that in.
He says he started using a respirator given out at his factory. It was becoming wildly popular and was supposed to help protect him from asbestos. It was called an 8710, made by 3M.
When the double strand came in, I thought, oh, that's pretty neat. And they had, you know, with the aluminum nose piece that you bent to fit your face. And everybody thought, wow, those are really neat. I always wear a mask.
According to 3M's advertising, it was easier to use, more comfortable, and it was going to help protect workers from deadly diseases, including black lung and asbestosis.
The 8710, that was a godsend. We thought that was that was really the hot setup.
We would discuss how badly they leaked.
Over 1,000 miles south of Mike's factory, Daryl Beavis was working in a lab with his boss, scientist Ed Hyatt, testing respirators.
We did not want to allow the 8710 or any other single-use respirator for that matter to be available at the laboratory.
One of Beavis and Hyatt's worries was that disposable respirators didn't safely fit everyone's face.
One size will not fit all. Looky here, we can mold this piece around the nose and everybody can wear it, but they couldn't.
Beavis worked with Hyatt at the famous Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, where the atomic bomb was developed.
With Geiger counters to check the radiation, experts assess the damage.
The Los Alamos lab also tested masks used for protection against dangerous and sometimes radioactive material.
Ed never liked the single use from the day he saw it. He said it's an accident waiting to happen, which I picked up, of course, and that's been my comment. It's an accident waiting to happen.
Beavis is talking about disposable masks, including the 8710 disposable respirator. And a bad fit meant the respirator might not make a good seal with the face, and contaminated air could get in.
If there's a gap, when you inhale, it's going to come in at any points of leakage, facepiece to face seal.
In 1970, Hyatt told 3M their respirators should have at least two sizes, our present one and a smaller one, if we hope to fit the majority of workers. For Hyatt, the benefits of more mask sizes were obvious. But the 8710 was good enough for the U.S. government. It would soon approve it and other single-use respirators for many dusts, including asbestos. Years later, a 3M official would testify the 8710 itself came in one size, but the company did sell other sizes. They just weren't called 8710.
Next, do workers' respirators do the job?
The respirator simply would not provide protection against asbestos.
Back in the 1970s, scientist Ed Hyatt wanted to make sure all workers had respirators that safely fit them. But Hyatt was concerned that many disposable respirators, including 3M's 8710, came in only one size. Hyatt told 3M that the masks should come in more sizes. Daryl Beavis worked with Hyatt at the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico.
At Los Alamos, we found out very, very quickly that we needed multiple sizes.
For the U.S. government, though, the mask passed all the tests and was approved in 1972. The respirator eventually sold millions.
If you wore a mask very long, it was on inside and outside. You could see it. Just little teeny particles, little colors. The outside, a lot.
Fiberglass factory worker Michael Leslie says he used 3M's 8710. He says the mask didn't work well, that it leaked and let dust in.
In here, you'd get kind of a dusty channel right in here. And that's after pinching the aluminum piece.
Critics say that in 1972, NIOSH, the key U.S. testing and approval agency, required only limited testing for the 8710 to see how well it fit on the face. 3M says its tests went well beyond what the government required. Since its approval, studies have shown the respirator effectively protects workers from many airborne contaminants, including asbestos. Also, research shows the 8710 provided a good fit if users followed instructions. Beavis, who now flies around the U.S. and testifies on behalf of people suing 3M, says the government regulations were weak.
Our approval standards are very bad. All regulations are absolute minimum requirements.
After the U.S. federal approval, Hyatt wrote a report to the government saying more testing would need to be done before it is demonstrated that only one size of respirator is satisfactory. By 1980, NIOSH did know how deadly asbestos really was and was deeply concerned. Changing its earlier position, it now told 3M, "It is not our position that single-use dust respirators will provide adequate protection against the cancer-causing potential of asbestos." But NIOSH said it couldn't void the approval of the respirator against asbestos without following appropriate administrative procedures. So instead, called for more study and data from the manufacturers.
What 3M was told was this is dangerous to use this mask with people who are exposed to asbestos. They didn't take away the seal of approval. And what did 3M do? They continued to market it for asbestos.
Dr. David Eagleman is an expert in asbestos-related disease. He spends a lot of time going through old company records because he testifies against big corporations that he says have hurt people's health. Eagleman has been called a public health crusader, and courts have not accepted his testimony in every case. But he says asbestos dust is one of the biggest workplace killers.
It irritates the cells in some way, we don't know exactly how, gets into the DNA, the nucleus, which controls cell growth, and they lose control over the growth of the cells. That's the definition of cancer.
Despite concerns, 3M continued to market and sell these respirators for protection against asbestos, and still with the government's approval. 16 by 9 wanted to know more about the effectiveness of the respirator, so we asked 3M for an on-camera interview. 3M refused, instead providing a written statement. 3M points to extensive government data that says masks like the 8710 fit and work well. In fact, U.S. government regulators have long said the 8710 provides better protection than experts like Beavis argue. But asbestos is very dangerous, and just a small amount of exposure can be deadly. So eventually, in 1986, the U.S. government issued more stringent regulations that effectively put an end to the use of disposable respirators like the 8710 for use against asbestos.
The respirator simply would not provide protection against asbestos. Ultimately, the single-use respirator was going to leak far greater than they wanted any respirator used for protection against our carcinogens.
But while in the U.S. laws were getting stricter and 3M was no longer selling the mask for asbestos, one 3M official testified that in 1999, the company was still selling the 8710 in Canada as effective against asbestos, almost 15 years after it stopped in the U.S. Michael Leslie says he used the mask at the job site for about a year after it was approved. Now he's been diagnosed with mesothelioma, one of the deadliest forms of cancer, a cancer he thinks could have been prevented with a better mask.
When I think back on it, I'm just, geez, I wish I'd have had something else. I realized that no matter how many I would have worn, it still wouldn't work.
Michael sued several companies, including 3M, saying the mask didn't protect him. In court documents, 3M argued Michael's employer was responsible for workplace safety and making sure masks fit workers, and that there was no evidence that his employer measured the level of asbestos in the air, important for choosing the right respirator. 3M also denied its mask could be blamed, saying that Leslie was exposed to asbestos for over a decade without any respirator, and he may not have worn the 3M mask at all while working with asbestos. Nothing was proven in court because the case was settled. These days, Michael is just focusing on the time he has left.
I'm not afraid of dying. You know, I've been happy. I'm really super lucky because I trust in God and all that stuff. I wish it wouldn't have happened so that I have more time with my family.
They settle cases where they think they're going to lose.
3M has never lost a case at trial or admitted wrongdoing. But according to 3M financial reports, the company has paid out over $150 million in the last 4 years, mostly on respirator mask litigation, fees, and settlements. Dr. Eagleman works on behalf of workers suing 3M.
I've been an expert in cases where, in my view, their respirators failed to protect people and people got sick.
But 3M says workers could have gotten sick because they did not consistently wear a respirator. Employers could have chosen the wrong breathing protection for the hazards in the air. Workers may not have been trained by their employers on proper use of respirators. Or the employers may not have tested regularly to ensure that respirators fit on people's faces. The 8710 is no longer sold in the U.S. and Canada for asbestos protection, and 3M faces many respirator lawsuits in the U.S. But despite that, the 8710 is still sold for use with asbestos in India.
From a health and safety perspective, they shouldn't be doing that. From a moral perspective, they shouldn't be doing that. From an ethical perspective, they shouldn't be doing that.
3M told 16 by 9 each country establishes its own safety and health regulations, and the respirators meet the highest regulatory requirements of each nation where they are sold. 3M also said that the respirators sold today are not necessarily identical to the 8710 respirators that were sold previously in the United States.
Next, fighting for better protection against a deadly disease.
You don't gamble like that. You're literally gambling with nurses' lives.
It is imperative that nurses get the optimal level of protection from Ebola. We deserve better!
Nurses today are demanding protections that workers back in the 1970s thought they had. Those workers used disposable respirators that manufacturers promised would help protect them from dangers like asbestos. But critics say standards back then were lax, and it took years, even decades, for governments to tighten the rules on respirators used against asbestos. These nurses want tough rules now so that their masks protect them today.
You're still on the front lines. You're on the front lines of every deadly thing.
The World Health Organization calls it the most severe acute public health emergency seen in modern times, Ebola.
We knew that it was known as a nurse killer in West Africa. We knew at that time that it was going to be here.
Bonnie Castillo is a nurse who works for the biggest nurses union in the U.S. After Ebola broke out in West Africa, her organization started raising red flags, warning politicians they needed to get ready for it here.
It wasn't if, it was when.
Ebola, a deadly disease that can kill in weeks, is acquired by exposure to a carrier's bodily fluid. When it was first discovered, it had a close to 90% kill rate. For years, it was a remote African problem, until, in 1989, the first scare in North America.
Imagine a world where infectious disease has run amok.
Scientists feared that infected research monkeys had passed it to humans.
So at that point, no one worked with the virus any longer outside of a BL4 lab wearing a spacesuit.
Then, in 2014, the biggest outbreak ever. Over 8,000 dead, almost all in West Africa. This time, the killer virus did make it to North America.
A Dallas nurse becoming the first person to contract the deadly virus here in the U.S.
And healthcare workers were getting infected.
Only 4 days after critical care nurse Nina Pham was found to be infected with Ebola, a second healthcare worker has been diagnosed with the deadly disease.
Mark Nikas was also worried. Nikas is a professor at University of California, Berkeley, and is an expert on how contagious diseases are spread. He has studied how they are prevented with respirators.
You're dealing with an agent that is fatal, and you're sending people, healthcare workers, into an environment where they're dealing with Ebola patients with a respirator that allows 10% leakage of air.
He is talking about disposable respirators. This one is used for contagious diseases, and it's called an N95. Nikas is disturbed that the U.S. and Canadian governments are recommending nurses use this disposable mask to prevent Ebola.
It's a ridiculous public health policy because it allows too much risk.
Public health authorities say Ebola is not an airborne disease. But Nikas says Ebola patients can spread tiny particles that carry Ebola. Particles emitted during coughing, vomiting, or medical procedures.
If I can be hit in the face with one of those particles as a projectile, then it's coming close enough to me that I can also inhale it. Because it's possible to inhale an aerosol that contains Ebola virus, then it's possible to catch Ebola due to inhalation of particles that carry Ebola. It's biologically possible.
He says that the 10% that disposable masks might leak is way too risky, given the danger of Ebola.
It's a careless way to prescribe protection.
It leaks. We know it leaks. We have experience with this. You don't gamble like that. You're literally gambling with nurses' lives.
Daryl Beavis is a longtime critic of respirator regulations. Now he fears history is repeating itself. He is worried the same weak government oversight he says he saw in the 1970s is back.
I'm beginning to wonder if they can spell respirator, let alone make decisions.
Beavis thinks government regulators are making mistakes in their respirator recommendations for Ebola. While Beavis wants tougher government rules, one mask manufacturer told 16x9 the N95 is only one piece of protection against Ebola, and employers are responsible to fully protect workers. These nurses taking to the streets just want to prevent possible mistakes and avoid becoming a generation of victims.
Most nurses have been sprayed. They've been coughed on, they've been sneezed on, they've been vomited on, they've had blood contamination. So to say that they should not have the highest level of protection, in our minds, is criminal.
Nurses in California reached out to different levels of government hoping for action on respirators, and their state held a hearing.
They're going to demand the optimal standard with the greatest level of precaution.
Infectious disease are a significant threat to public safety.
So, in California, this is what full protection looks like now. A full face hood with purified air pumped into it.
We have now the hazmat coverall suits that meet our standards, which means that they are bloodborne, virus, protective.
But protection isn't required to look like this in many parts of Canada. Respiratory codes and practices vary between provinces. And in some parts of Canada, regulations don't require more protection than an N95.
Every hospital has to have that level of protection. This is not the time for debates. What you do is you hit it hard and you hit it with everything you've got.
Factory for the world. A generation before Made in China. A time when jobs were plentiful for people who made things. In the 60s and 70s, it seemed like the economy would grow forever. But an invisible threat was growing as well. People learned poisons in the workplace could kill if they didn't have a way to protect themselves.
Increasingly, in recent years, we're discovering that the seeds of some cancers are being sown in the workplace.
So, many employers and workers put part of their trust in a revolutionary piece of equipment, the face mask.
Today, thanks to the cooperation of safety men in many industries.
No, it was like a realization that I don't care what anybody says, I don't want to breathe that in.
He says he started using a respirator given out at his factory. It was becoming wildly popular and was supposed to help protect him from asbestos. It was called an 8710. Made by 3M.
When the double strand came in, I thought, oh, that's pretty neat. And they had, with the aluminum nose piece that you bent to fit your face. And everybody thought, wow, those are really neat. I always wear a mask.
According to 3M's advertising, it was easier to use, more comfortable, and it was going to help protect workers from deadly diseases, including black lung and asbestosis.
The 8710, that was a godsend. We thought that.
And government departments who supported and helped guide the development of respiratory protection, the menace in the air is removed for those who wear respirators.
Back in the 1970s, Michael Leslie worked in a factory that made molded fiberglass, a place where, he says, the air was often thick with asbestos dust.
We bought it in like 40, 50-pound bags, heavy-duty bags, and it was just a real soft, billowy, wasn't real heavy, but it was, if you go like that, dust would just fly off of it.
Michael didn't know much about asbestos or its dangers, but he says he dealt with dusty air at a previous job and didn't want to breathe it in at this one.
I got kind of kicked in the pants when I saw that stuff coming through the window.
The disposable respirator is a simple enough device, a cheap, easy-to-use mask designed to keep dust out of the lungs. But over the years, critics of that simple respirator have raised serious questions. They said some masks didn't go far enough to protect workers against deadly dust like asbestos. Now, some nurses who are worried they'll come into contact with Ebola are also asking the government tough questions and wondering if the mask they'll wear will protect them. Jill Kropp has the story.
It was a time when North America was the...
that was really the hot setup.
We would discuss how badly they leaked.
Over 1,000 miles south of Mike's factory, Daryl Beavis was working in a lab with his boss, scientist Ed Hyatt, testing respirators.
We did not want to allow the 8710 or any other single-use respirator for that matter to be available at the laboratory.
One of Beavis and Hyatt's worries was that disposable respirators didn't safely fit everyone's face.
One size will not fit all. Looky here, we can mold this piece around the